So, if you're someone who's just getting started in videography or photography, or even someone who's had years of experience under their belt, I'm sure you've taken notice of the auto switch. Now, different layouts may vary from different cameras and image qualities as well, but it doesn't matter what you're using, something of the likes of the A7 III here, or any other camera you might have at your disposal. I can assure you, every camera has an auto switch. But if you've had the time and knowledge in learning exposure settings and understanding of correct white balance and global shutter angles, then you must have complete confidence in your capabilities in every possible situation thrown at you. Or, hear me out, are we wasting our time in nitpicking on settings while cameras such as our phones have little to no control at all, yet we rarely complain? So in this little experiment, we're going to take a look and compare images when you set everything in auto, or does spending countless of hours, maybe even years, makes any difference at all? Now, let's get a few things straight. This is not a test about compositioning or lighting, so I won't be going into much of that because that would probably make this video an hour long. So for those who are here to learn a quick crash course on manual exposure, there's only 4 main factors to consider which you would be likely to be able to control despite whatever camera you are using. But if you are super knowledgeable already, just stick around for a bit before we start, or you could just fast forward to the end where this experiment actually pans out. Number 1 is global shutter speed, or global shutter angle, or shutter speed alone. This setting is dependent on the frame rate you set. For instance, if you're at 25 frames per second, you want to double this frame rate. So 25 frame rates times 2, or 25 FPS times 2 equals to 50. This is to sync frequencies of the lights that might be around you to avoid flickering, but also to have that cinematic effect of motion blur. If your camera is capable of shooting, say, 100 frames per second, then those same rules apply. Double the shutter speed and you should be getting this right outputs. Number 2 is iris. Again, very basic information here. The more light you allow into the sensor, the less ISO you will need to determine how much darker or brighter your image will be. So let's say if you're out in a sunny day and have no ND filters to tone down the sun's brightness, you'd want to increase the aperture so you allow less light in. But if you're in a lit surrounding, you want to do the opposite and lower it down. This also affects how much depth of field you get depending on your lens f-stop, as faster lenses that can go down to say f1.8, you would be able to get all of the background behind you to be blurred out. Let's say if you're at f10, you get everything from the background and your subject evenly focused. And number 3 is ISO. ISO is the setting to determine the sensitivity of your sensor. So depending on how much light you allow in from your aperture, images will look clearer and sharper when you set the lowest setting possible. This is very important for low light situation, as you'd want to avoid noise or grain. Number 4 is white balance. This is to ensure the warmth or coolness of your image depending on the light available to you. So the warmer the image, the higher your white balance needs to be, and vice versa. The light above me is about 5,000 Kelvin. The light behind me is about 3,000 Kelvin. So you get what I mean. This is also highly important to determine skin tones, and by far the hardest to fix in post if you got the settings wrong, like how I did in my examples of the A7 IV review. So click on that if you'd want to see how even professionals like myself still get things wrong every now and then. Which is why I've had the need to see if you could just shoot everything and while letting the camera do all the work for you. I mean, if you're keen to making into a profession or even just a hobby, there's so many factors to consider in getting your image just right, especially if you're in a run and gun type of shoot like we usually have here on the channel, or if you're just a one-person shooter like I am and you could use the extra headspace to make a decent video. Now, after all of that basic information is out of the way, let's get this real-world test going. Okay, so I am now going to set it in auto. I have to say, I've never done this before. I've never actually set it into auto. So as much of an experiment this is for all of us, it is much of a discovery for me. Okay, so we've set it in auto and it is telling me it is shooting at 320 frames, ISO auto, f5.0. Okay, so let's press record. I mean, that's all you gotta do, I guess. I mean, it's supposed to do everything for you. And yeah, this is the whole experiment, trying to understand whether there's a difference at all if shooting in auto or manual. And this is in manual mode. So I think mostly under sunlight, the most important things you have to be wary about is highlights and exposures, of course. So that's why we shoot in manual exposure mode, to give you more control in understanding where is the sun, where is the light coming from, where is your shadows. Okay, that was first location, and now let's move on to the next one. Okay, so this is another angle of the bamboo house right in front of us. It is showing 1/60th frames per second and f11 ISO auto, set to auto, of course. And yeah, I mean, from the screen I can tell the shadows are way too darker than I want them to, because I think it's compensating for the sky at the back, and also the details of the roof I kind of want more. Okay, now I'm setting it into manual mode, and just like I said, I want the shadows of the roof to slightly be more visible, right? Because I don't really care too much about the back, and I guess 5000 Kelvin is okay, and 50th of a second f9 and ISO 100. 1/50th f8 ISO 100. Okay, so that's done. Let's move on to the next location. Okay, so here we are at the second location, and this is in manual mode. I still have set it in, it's still in manual mode. Again, 50 frames per second. Now f14, ISO 100. So I'm going to press that record and just let that roll for the next few seconds before I set it into auto. Okay, I think that's more than enough. That's more than enough footage to go around. And now we're going to set it in auto. Again, it's showing me 320 frames, 1/320, f5, and ISO auto. Okay, so that's done. Let's move on to the next location. Maybe something with more sky. Let's give it a challenge to the camera, see whether that auto mode does a difference in, or knows the difference between highlights and shadows as much as our eyes can. Okay, so it's showing me, and right now it's set to auto, and it's showing me 1/1000 right now. And yeah, I would never set it into this setting if it was in manual mode. I guess it just doesn't really recognize how to bring up the f-stop more compared to the shutter speed. Okay, now it's dropped significantly at 400th, and it has stopped up to f11. I mean, right away I can tell like the sky is very well exposed, but not so much on the trees down there and the buildings as well. The buildings are kind of crushed down, but mostly that tree, I can barely see that tree now. Okay, now I'm gonna set it to manual mode. So now we are in manual mode, and I am shooting at f22, 60th over 1/60th, ISO 100, and I'm gonna hit record. So yes, right away I can tell the sky is definitely just blown out, but I'm only doing that because I want to retain the shadows that we lost in the auto mode. Now you can grab some idea about where the tree was and how does the tree look like. But as for the sky is definitely way too blown out. This is definitely going to help if you shoot in S-Log2, anything with high dynamic range. But for the sake of this test, I have left it in picture profile. I've turned off the picture profile, so yeah, we don't get extra information that we would require in this kind of setting. But yeah, there's the whole point of the test, to see whether the auto can see better than our eyes. Okay, so that's done, and let's go to the next location. I think I'll be very much more interested in knowing how this plays out when you have a human subject in it, because there's only so much the camera can do on its own, which is knowing what kind of skin tones a person has, and that's something that only your eyes can tell, or just general knowledge and experience. But yeah, who do I call? I might have an idea. So I called him. I called Ernest out of all of you. He's our new tech reviewer, our community reviewer, and yeah, he's gonna be our test subjects for like skin tones and
government experimentations.
Yeah, whatever you said. But mostly trying to determine skin tones, whether that affects using auto or manual. Are you a auto or manual kind of guy?
I'm an auto everything kind of guy until I need to manual it.
Yeah.
I'm an auto everything first. Because why?
See, and I'm a manual kind of guy. So I like having control in you know, setting images correctly, exposing stuff correctly.
Sometimes you need to let go control and let it expose for you correctly.
Whatever. I mean, I was just reviewing some of the footages I took earlier, and yeah, there are some of the benefits of you shooting in auto, because you might not even tell using the small screen that you have on your cameras.
On the same token, he hates vertical videos, but I love vertical videos. Sorry, carry on. He's Fitri. He's one of those old school photographers or videographers that have a fixed mindset. Come on, you gotta have growth mindset. Auto, man. The Sonys are doing pretty good. You know this, man.
Yeah, I mean, we are privileged to be using really good cameras. There's some people out there who are just starting out with, you know, who knows, something much lesser than the likes of the A63-300 or A7 III. And those cameras might suffer. Those cameras might have troubles in exposing things right. That's why I assume that starting off with manual, learning the basics first, will help you in the long run in situations where you can't rely on your camera to do the things that you want them to. So yeah.
All true. All true.
All true. Okay, let's get on with this test.
Okay.
Okay, I'm shooting at 1/50th f5. ISO 100, about 4,800 Kelvin. So yeah, stop right there, and skin tones look intact. Okay, now I've set it into auto. It's still showing me 1/50th, f5.6, and I have no idea what white balance it's set in right now. And stop. And those are the skin tones, properly exposed. All right. Okay, this is just about to test the indoor to outdoor kind of scenario. So I have, this is manual, in manual mode, 1/50th, f3.5, ISO 320, and I will be shifting this manually with the f-stop and stopping down up to f7, and white balance is set to 4,900. Those kind of burnt, but overall that's how I would usually shoot. Okay, so we are in auto, and weirdly it's stopped down to 1/25th and f3.5. Again, I have no idea what it's set in for white balance, and ISO is also at auto. So yeah, that's the main benefits of setting things in auto. You don't have to worry about overexposing your subjects or burning out the highlights of anything that's white or easily blown out when messing with highlights. Okay, so we are gonna do some tests on low light to see whether there's differences in noise or grain using manual mode or auto. So I think just the kind of the walk-in phase that we did just now. But yeah, let's see how it looks like with the auto feature and manual feature. Okay, so I'm shooting at 1/50th again, f3.5, but a very high ISO at 3200. Let's check the skin tones. Can you stop there? I've set the white balance at 3007. The darks are, yeah, it doesn't look too noisy. All right, let's go into auto. Okay, this is shooting in auto mode, 1/25th at 3.5. I have no idea what the ISO is. Stop there. Does a pretty decent job too. Yeah, that's the low light test, I guess, for you. Okay, Auto Man, right now that you discovered auto versus manual.
Here's what I would manual and what I would auto. When I said I auto, I mean that I auto the focus. When it comes to the exposure, sometimes I'll just set it first. I'll set the exposure, shutter speed, f-stop, ISO, and then I will just let the camera do its thing when it comes to focus. So I do use manual. It's not like I hate manual.
I mean, like from this test right now we're doing, like, can you tell any difference?
From that test that you just did, I like both. And maybe because I saw the manual one last, maybe I like the manual one more. I'm not sure if it's biased because I saw it last visually, but I like both. They look good, especially auto. True story.
Okay, that's just one person's verdict. I guess you guys can have your own verdict. Please comment down below which one do you prefer, auto or manual. I have yet to get into the post-production side and see this on a big screen. Shut up, man. But yeah, that's a whole nother process that I'll be getting into in just a bit. So stand by. Okay, so we are here back in the studio or my office or my room. I want to be going through the footages on a bigger screen because I can only tell so much from the small screen of the A7 III, and those screens are usually not the best to consider whether or not you've gotten things exposed properly or see the white balance as you want them to turn out. And usually I do realize, like, I will set the settings to be lower, the white balance to be lower than it should, but I usually do that to compensate for the skin tones. So in this footage of Ernest, he's just walking into the frame, and I mean, I'm paying attention more on his skin tones, and they look more intact as compared to the auto version. The auto version does get the background just right, but it's a bit too warm on his skin, and probably it would work better if you're shooting in, say, S-Log2, that you can manipulate a bit more colors. But I mean, it doesn't stray too far away from his natural skin tone, but it's still a bit too warm for my liking, because if you're shooting at picture profile off, you got all of those colors baked in already, and you can't really change much from his skin tones. And if you were to work on it in post-production, it would take a lot of effort to get it right. You might get things wrong on the back end of the image, say like hit the greens or the blues. Yeah, you might get those wrong. But I will commend the camera for doing the sceneries better than my eyes did, because even though the trees on the bottom were slightly underexposed, it didn't overexpose the sun. And this is something I didn't really realize as much from the main camera screen. From my explanation earlier, I could definitely tell shooting in manual, I was already overexposing the sky. Shooting in auto, even though it did push up to 1/1000 shutter speed, at least it did compensate from keeping the highlights intact, and even though the shadows were a bit too dark for my liking, it still captured everything clear and crisp. As for the bamboo house that we shot, I think we still did better in manual. I think the white balance was a bit too cool, but this could also be effect of my A7 III, and I am shooting in 8-bit, not 10-bit. It could be the cause of that. It has a bit of that green tint like you get from these older cameras as compared to like the A7S III or A7 IV. If you have one of those cameras, then I'm sure they would do better in auto than my A7 III. Again, I need to mention, like, this all depends on what cameras you are using. So if you're using something of the likes of a prosumer camera like I am, then yeah, the results will be different. If you're using something of the likes of, say, A6 3000 or a Canon M50, yeah, anything in the budget range to entry level range, they might come out different. I would have loved to done a test on that, but I didn't have any of those cameras at my disposal. So please let me know what cameras you guys are using if you are trying this out. But yeah, going back to the footages, for low light or night scenes, they were very close. They were super close. I mean, I could barely find any differences. Aside from, again, it's slightly warmer or cooler. The white balance, the auto white balance did a better job, I guess, at differentiating from the bright screen behind Ernest and the yellow lights behind on the left of him, and it did a better job at retaining skin tones more than just setting it to one setting. But in terms of noise or grain, I am shooting in 4K 25. I don't really see much noise or grain here. I mean, it was evenly lit. There were some parts where it did get kind of crushed in terms of the blacks. It didn't compromise the subject itself, which is Ernest in this footage. I mean, the only thing that does flail back and forth, which was the shutter speed, so you might not get the motion blur that you want, because sometimes it will go above 100 and it will compensate that with the ISO. Not too much of a difference, but still very commendable for what it did. I guess my conclusion to all of this is that it did expose a lot of my weaknesses in what my eyes were able to tell, and parts where I did feel confident, which was mostly in lighting or settings that didn't require me to second guess myself whether it's overexposed or underexposed. I mean, that's what the exposure meter is there for. So you want to keep an eye on that the most. Maybe I should have brought it up a bit more in terms of the white balance. So as much of it being a unknown or uncharted territories when I got into all of this, I'm more confident now to leave the camera to shoot in auto, especially if I'm shooting by myself, which I usually am, and not consider too much about doing all of the work, because you wouldn't want to get your footage wrong just because you want to always constantly shoot in manual exposure. There's always a scenario for it. There's always a time for you to be using auto. I think I would be using auto more now since I have tested this out. But if it's on a control set, obviously this whole test doesn't even apply, because you already get all the information of what the light is around you and what frame rates you're going to be shooting in. It was a fun experiment. I hope you guys learned something from this as much as I did. It was not much, it was not crazy amounts of knowledge that I gained here, but I'm surprised about how technological these cameras are becoming, and they're not exactly to the standards of how phone cameras have been performing, because like iPhone 13s recently, they've been amazing. And if you're in a running situation where you can't afford to take out your camera, then usually your cell phones will be the situation where you want to consider using instead of SLR cameras. But if you are, then yes, definitely consider using auto mode if you want to. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the video. If you already are, this is a very fun experiment. Thank you so much. See you guys in the next one. Bye bye.